Some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
On April 4th, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. The assassination of the civil rights leader left the nation reeling in anger and grief. Demonstrations broke out across the country. A group of students at the University of Minnesota got together to talk about how to respond to the assassination in a way that would honor Dr. King.
They had talked to administrators. They had tried to demonstrate the need for African American studies, and they weren't being heard.
This is civic leader and activist Josie Johnson. Johnson's life and activism are the subject of a new film from Twin Cities PBS called Hope in the Struggle. At the time of the assassination, Johnson was a community leader who had been providing support and guidance to Black student organizers on the University of Minnesota campus. Ultimately, the student organizers came up with a list of demands that they felt the university could take in response to the assassination of Dr. King. But after months of waiting for the university to respond, and after talking with leaders like Johnson, the students decided to take a more direct action. On January 14th, 1969, about 70 students staged a day-long occupation of the bursar's office, located inside Morrill Hall on the university campus.
Through their effort, and the effort of a lot of white kids on the campus as well, supported our students, and they all stood arm to arm in the Morrill Hall takeover.
The Morrill Hall takeover led to a number of institutional changes at the university, including the establishment of the African American and African Studies Department that still exists today. The takeover is one of the most cited examples of a successful direct action by student protesters in the University of Minnesota's history.
It's sort of set a precedent for the effectiveness of student protest because there were so many gains made out of the occupation of Morrill Hall.
This is Mira Altabel Resendez. They are a 2022 graduate of the University of Minnesota, and they were a member of Students for a Democratic Society while on campus. Altabel Resendez was also one of 9 protesters who were arrested in the spring of 2024 during the weeks-long student-led encampment on the University of Minnesota campus in support of Gaza and the university's divestment from Israel. Altabel Resendez says that the 2024 protesters at the University of Minnesota were, in part, inspired by the direct actions of the Morrill Hall takeover. They point out that students have always had the power to change their institutions and, in turn, to change culture.
The wins of the Morrill Hall takeover, like all of the ethnic studies programs, those are all just integrated into the norms of the university now. And young people are responsible for this. It's not whoever was in administration on the Board of Regents at that time.
So, how do student protests impact universities? And what elements of the University of Minnesota are a direct result of student organizing of the past? I'm Julie Censullo, and this is Playback, the show where we hit rewind and look back on Minnesota history.
Many of us, myself included, contacted our family members, as I did. I told my father to expect to have to raise bail money to get me out of jail because we were taking over Morrill Hall.
Today, we are examining the anatomy of the Morrill Hall takeover, a protest that changed the University of Minnesota forever. I'm speaking with John Wright, who is a professor emeritus of African American and African Studies and English at the University of Minnesota. He was also a participant in the Morrill Hall takeover of 1969. John, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure.
We are going to get into talking about the Morrill Hall takeover, but before we do that, I want to start by talking about your personal experience with the University of Minnesota. I know you came to the university after your father had been a student there. Can you tell me about your family's history at the university?
Be glad to. Both my father and my aunt, Martha, were students at the university in the mid-1930s. They had graduated from North High in 1934 at a time when North High was not considered to be a, quote, black, unquote, school. But both of my father and my aunt were preceded in terms of contacts with the university by my grandfather, John Wright I, for whom I'm named.
It sounds like you had some very deep roots at the university. Had your father and your aunt and your grandfather told you stories about the culture of the university or about their experiences of being Black students on campus before you enrolled as a student?
Well, there were a number of anecdotes, stories that my family elders communicated to me. When my grandfather was on campus in 1902, Cyrus Northrop was the president of the university then, and that was an era in which a number of, for instance, of African-American law students had access to this public land-grant institution and had graduated or in the process of graduating and becoming part of the local communities. The Northrop administration of the university was regarded as favorable. It's not repressive or segregationist. That would change with the presidency of Lotus Kaufman, who would become the longest-serving University of Minnesota president. And it was he who brought Jim Crow policies into official effect on the campus. The segregation of dormitories, the denial of Black students access to dormitories, to the continuing segregation of sororities and fraternities and social clubs, to the exclusionary and marginalizing postures taken by the university coaches in athletics, etc.
And so when you became a student in 1963, had the culture around race changed much since your father and aunt were students at the university?
The numbers of Black students on campus when my father and aunt were here in the 30s was somewhere in the low 40s.
Sure.
That had not changed dramatically in the decades between their time on campus and when I came on campus in 1963.
Mm-hmm.
Our Black student organization that we put together, the first one was called Students for Racial Progress, or STRAP. We couldn't identify more than about 75 Black students on campus. And many of that student group were athletes from out of state who had become a presence on campus only at the end of the 1950s when the Gopher football coach Murray Warmath, who had been under fire for his lack of winning seasons as Gopher football coach, had brought the university national championships by recruiting a whole cadre, a whole cohort of superb Black athletes from the Jim Crow South. So anyway, the number of Black students on campus hadn't changed dramatically during those years, and many local Black families were still choosing to send their children to the HBCUs rather than come to the University of Minnesota.
Yeah, I want to go back to STRAP, or Students for Racial Progress, the student group that you mentioned. Can you tell me more about the work that STRAP was doing on campus?
Well, we were one of a number of Black student organizations that were developing on historically white college campuses, public and private, in the early 1960s, as the formerly segregated northern white public colleges and universities began to have a trickle of Black students entering. Our group, STRAP, which was led by a very energetic Black student from Louisiana named Lucien Scotty Stone, we called him Scotty all the time, was strongly affiliated again with the civil rights movement. Scotty was a decided follower and apostle of MLK. And we aligned ourselves very early on in STRAP's history with the freedom movements, the freedom struggles in the Deep South that were largely led by Black students on Southern college campuses who were trying to desegregate lunch counters and drugstores and deal with the surviving de jure, that is legal segregation constraints of of life in the Jim Crow South.
I know Strapp was actually responsible for bringing Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to speak at the University of Minnesota in April of 1967, almost 1 year before his assassination. Here is some tape of him speaking at the U of M.
And after you change the habits of people, pretty soon their attitudes will begin to change and they will adjust to it. And I say that all over the country, we need strong civil rights legislation that's vigorously enforced. The problem is that we see backlashing all along.
Well, so we brought Dr. King here in the spring of '67, in part because he was facing the challenges from a younger generation of students who were questioning the efficacy of the civil rights agenda, its strategy, its tactics, its underlying philosophy of nonviolent direct action. The previous years, from 1964 to 1967, were tumultuous years in this country on multiple fronts because of the combined influences of the Vietnam War and the anti-Vietnam War movement, and, of course, because of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement's achievements, particularly in terms of legislation, were increasingly being questioned or challenged by a younger generation of black college students and our allies across the color line because of the seeming lack of tangible results from that civil rights legislation. And that tension had generated the rise of the Black Power movement, many of whose leaders, people like Stokely Carmichael, who had become disillusioned by the civil rights movement's failures and had begun, as Stokely Carmichael did in 1966, articulating an alternative agenda that would come to be called Black Power. So that was the context in which we brought Dr. King to campus in April of 1967.
And I know 1 month later, Strapp also brought Stokely Carmichael to campus too.
And Stokely Carmichael gave an address to a packed house in Williams Arena.
The fact is that what must be abolished is not the black community, but the dependent and colonial status that has been inflicted upon it. This is the essential difference between integration as it is currently practiced and the concept of black power.
We brought them here as a tandem, as it were, because we wanted to hear both sides of the debate.
So this is all really helpful context for some of the events and the ideas that students like you were grappling with leading up to the events of the Morrill Hall takeover. But is there an inciting incident that causes you to take action?
The assassination of Dr. King was the immediate impetus. Because, again, Dr. King was assassinated on a Friday in Memphis. And over the following weekend, the country exploded. More than 100 American cities experienced massive rebellions far beyond the capacity of local police forces to contend. And we met, our student group, we had changed our name from Strapp to the Afro-American Action Committee, in part because of the influence I alluded to earlier on here of the Black Power movement. And we met in the early days to decide how we could respond, and to just respond in a way that would both honor Dr. King and would contribute to constructive reform on our campus.
And what did that response look like for your group, for the newly renamed Afro-American Action Committee, or AAAC?
Well, our leadership then, and Rosemary Freeman was the AAAC president, Horace Huntley was vice president, Anna Stanley, I believe, was also a vice president. They were the three primary leaders of the group. I was a member of our executive committee, and the leadership asked me to draft a response to then be presented to the Malcolm Moose administration.
And Malcolm Moose is the president of the university.
Malcolm Moose was the president of the university. So I drafted a list of 7 demands that we then submitted to the Moose administration before the end of that week.
And what were some of the key demands that you had put forward?
I wanted to draft a set of demands that included both practical, achievable goals and goals also that had perhaps more broader and principle-oriented or philosophical kinds of objectives. So the demands included specific requests, for instance, that 200 full scholarships be made available to graduating Black Minnesota high school students in the following year. Another one of the specific demands was that a group be organized to review the policies of the university's athletic department towards Black athletes. There were still paternalistic and constraining aspects of the policies of the athletic department towards Black athletes that prevented numbers of them, for instance, in being members of our student group of the Afro-American Action Committee for fear of losing their scholarships. Also, we asked, for instance, that Dr. King's name be given serious consideration for that new West Bank library. We asked also that counseling and advising services, especially geared to the needs of Black students, be created. And again, there had been no attempts to recruit or admit African American students or Native American students or Chicano students to the university in the past. And so that kind of specific demand was raised.
And what was the administration's response?
The initial administration response was to do what universities do, which is to set up a task force to study the problem, try to address the demands we had put forward.
I'm guessing from the way that you put that the task force was not as effective at moving things along as you might have liked.
There was some movement. All right. During the summer of 1968, an initial effort at recruiting Black students, other students of color, was undertaken. And I and 3 or 4 other members of AAAC participated in a recruiting effort, and we went door to door in Black and Hispanic and Native communities locally, distributing admissions materials, providing information about the university that had otherwise not been readily available in those communities. So again, we spent a couple of months during that summer doing so, but there was, at that point, had been no official reorganization in admissions and counseling that effort could fit under, organizationally.
So that was the summer. And when you got back to school in the fall of 1968, I understand that the task force was still moving very slowly. How did things start to come to a head that winter? What made AAAC start to consider a different action rather than just waiting for the task force to make a decision?
Well, we tried to monitor as best we could the progress of the task force, and so we tried to establish some regular communications, again with the leaders of the task force to find out how things were proceeding. And so that took place again during those fall months, and as things moved towards the Christmas break, it became increasingly clear that we were a long way from having anything substantive in place as the new year would begin.
Right.
So at the beginning of that new year, when the new quarter opened, January 14th of 1969, when finally Horace Huntley, Rosemary, I think Anna, 2 or 3 other members of the group went to the administration building, to Morrill Hall, to get a reading on where things stood. And that things were clearly unsatisfactory. That group came back to AAAC offices in the student union and reported to us the state of affairs, and we took then a vote on what action was necessary. And at that point, we decided that occupying Morrill Hall was the order of the day.
As you were deciding to take a more direct and much more visible action against the university, were you taking into consideration the potential consequences of that direct action?
So one of our tactical considerations was, what we could expect if we in fact occupied Morrill Hall from the police. And there were two double considerations there, because the university police force, of course, was presumably the immediate force that had providence over the campus, but the university's ties to the Minneapolis police force were also in question. We knew that the university police force and the Minneapolis police force had operated sometimes in connection, in collusion. So we thought it was quite likely that we were going to be jailed. Ultimately, we decided that nonviolent direct action, and that itself was an issue for us, because there were members of the group who thought perhaps even more forceful and nonviolent action might be in order. But we decided, in part in respect for Dr. King, to that nonviolent direct action was the appropriate course, and we could expect to be jailed as a consequence. So many of us, myself included, contacted our family members, as I did. I told my father to expect to have to raise bail money to get me out of jail, because we were taking over Morrill Hall, and the consequences were indeterminate, but that's what we expected.
What did your father say when you called him to tell him that?
My father also contacted my Aunt Martha. Their attitudes were in unison. They did not try to discourage me from what I was doing, nor discourage the group, but they said, be careful.
Yeah.
Right? And both of them made it clear that they believed that there was unfinished business with the University of Minnesota from their time there as students in the 1930s and their battle against the Kaufman administration's Jim Crow policies then.
Right. In some ways, you really were continuing on your family's legacy here. So take me to the scene in which you move into Morrill Hall.
We had proceeded from Kaufman Union down the east side of the mall across the old Washington Avenue Bridge, and had marched double file down the mall to the ground floor of Morrill Hall. And the question was is where we were going to go in the building once we entered. I suggested wherever we went in the building, we needed to go into the bursar's office, because that was where the daily business was conducted. And rather than trying to go to the president's office or one of the administrative offices, that would not necessarily stop business of the university, that we needed to occupy the bursar's office. And that is what we then proceeded to do.
And how long did you occupy the bursar's office?
We stayed there overnight, until the next morning. Some of us came and go. Some of us had different kinds of responsibilities. I stayed there most of the afternoon and early evening. I think about 15 or so of us were there on an unbroken stay over the whole night. We were joined along the way by some community members and some elders who brought us comfort, emotional, strategic support, and food and so forth.
I know there were a number of students who were actually counter-protesting your efforts and who were trying to get into Morrill Hall to confront you and to try and stop you.
Well, exactly. I mean, we had, again, there were a number of groups who allied themselves with us and who tried to prevent those white student organizations on the outside who felt outraged by our occupation of Morrill Hall and wanted to dislodge us and bring the protest to an end. And they were trying to break in.
That building deserves and ought to be open. I am compassionate with civil rights. I've never thought along color lines, but this is ridiculous. And I don't want to be redundant, but it is unreasonable, unjust, and illegal.
And we had some long-standing alliances, for instance, with SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and with members of the Minnesota Student Association. And that whole process led, again, some of the SDS members basically to sit down on the inside of the building doors there as one kind of barrier, and to help us move some desks and other physical barriers from their places in the bursar's space to help barricade the building to block the entrance again of people who might have turned the occupation from nonviolent into a violent confrontation, which we did not in any event want.
Right. Here is a recording of a white student trying to explain the goals of the protest.
And that's the truth. You're being inconvenienced. Now, the reason for that is not because we're against any student here. Not that we're trying to discriminate against any student. It's because it's because we believe that you can't wait 100 years to fill the bellies of hungry people. That if every student on this campus were committed to do something about the thing right now.
We're all going to the building with you, huh?
We're committed. No, I'm not suggesting that you go in the building with me. I'm suggesting that if you were committed to do something about the problem, this kind of thing would not have to take place.
And so how does the takeover come to an end? Is there an agreement that's eventually reached with the university?
4 or 5 of our leaders, including Rosemary and Horace and Anna, met with Malcolm Moose's team to try to negotiate an outcome. And, that took, some time, but out of it came 3 specific agreements.
I know some of the specific demands that the administration agreed to initially were more short-term, like the funding for a Black speaker conference on campus the following year. But some of the demands actually led to much larger institutional changes. So can you tell me about those?
The creation of the Martin Luther King Jr. Counseling and Advising Office in CLA, in the College of Liberal Arts. That would become, again, one of the lasting institutional achievements. We modeled that MLK advising program on a different model than was operative in the College of Liberal Arts at the time, or almost any other program on campus, in terms of not being a rubber stamp enterprise for student registration activities, but a counseling and advising program that would deal with the social and familial and psychological kinds of issues and concerns these non-traditional students experienced, and that were not being addressed in the university's general counseling and advising programs. And that was a manifestation, again, of that original demand for counseling and advising services and financial aid services specifically geared to the needs of Black students.
And of course, the other major institutional change is the establishment of the African American and African Studies Department. Why was that important to you and to the other student organizers of AAAC?
We had asked for a department in part because we had been studying the rising Black studies movement across the country and the debates about what kind of institutional structure, curricular structure was best. And we had become very skeptical about some of the marginally institutionalized programs and divisions and so-called, Black studies enterprises that had been created on campuses that didn't have tenured faculties, that didn't have independent budgets, that could be eliminated in comparatively short order. And it became clear to us that a full-fledged department was the institutional arrangement that we needed. We also, early on, did not want it to be a traditional academic unit, an isolated ivory tower enterprise without the kinds of community connections that we felt were absolutely critical to serving local Black communities as well as the larger national community. And so we wanted, as members of that initial faculty, people who were serious scholars, but who were grounded in community activism and community organizations. So initially, several of the key members of the department came out of that context. Josie Johnson, who had been an urban league operative locally, running the local urban league, but who had a background, again, in sociology and social welfare and so forth from Fisk University.
Yeah, Josie Johnson talks about some of the classes that she taught in the Twin Cities PBS film Hope in the Struggle.
The department was created. I was one of the first faculty. I taught 2 classes, Black families in white America and Black people and the welfare system.
The Morrill Hall takeover clearly had some very significant long-term impacts on the university. But I want to go back to the immediate aftermath. You mentioned that you went into the occupation well aware that there could be legal consequences. Were there any repercussions for those of you involved in the takeover?
Well, thankfully for us, President Moose and the administration decided not to take a strong-armed stance to the occupation. But the Hennepin County attorney would issue a blanket warrant for the arrest of Rosemary Freeman, Horace Huntley, Warren Tucker, Jane and John Doe, etc., for the whole organization. And two of those, Rosemary Freeman and Horace Huntley, recognized public leaders of the organization. And the third student, Warren Tucker, who was not an organization leader, but a young, enthusiastic member of the group who had run up alongside Horace and Rosemary as we crossed the Washington Avenue Bridge. And that photo, which was then on the front page of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune the following day, became the locus again of the Hennepin County attorney's indictment. Yeah, so the charges against Warren Tucker were ultimately dismissed. But Rosemary and Horace were convicted, but their sentences were stayed. But the trial made us very, very aware of how the law could be administered and manipulated to serve political ends and so forth, and how the voices of the justly aggrieved could be sidelined, subordinated, suppressed, whatever, in process.
What do you mean by that? How did you see the law being manipulated during the trial?
Well, a good deal of the court proceedings, for instance, focused on the alleged vandalism to Morrill Hall, to the bursar's office and the surrounding space, so on. And ultimately, the charges that Rosemary and Horace were convicted of, vandalism loomed large. But some of that vandalism also has been falsely attributed. One of the faculty members from the Department of History, Hy Berman, who was a member of the task force and a negotiating committee, would record that he observed members of the local media in the space adjoining the bursar's office, strewing papers and desk materials about so they could photograph them to represent in the local media of our vandalism of the space. So I say that issue remains a bone of contention. Mm-hmm. And again, for us, it became one of the evidences of how in the courtroom our views might be misrepresented.
Right. University President Malcolm Moose gave a press conference the day after the takeover ended. And it's interesting to listen to because he doesn't necessarily absolve the students, but you can hear in his responses even then that there was some question over who was responsible for the vandalism.
We have no way of knowing at this moment if students did that. We know that other people were put in the building that night. Now, in no way am I suggesting that there wasn't responsibility for those who took over the thing for some, perhaps, acts. But I am not going to comment on that at this time.
I'm curious, what do you see as the legacy of the Morrill Hall takeover?
Well, that's, in one sense, a fairly simple question, but with a not-so-simple answer. At the national level, we have to see it as part of, again, this broad pattern of Black student protests that expanded across the nation, that led to redefining the place of African Americans on college and higher education campuses across this country, public and private, and to the kinds of interventions, curricular interventions that the Black Studies movement provided, and along with it in its wake, the Women's Studies movement, the Chicano Studies movement, a whole array of other movements representing social justice efforts and redefinitions of the meanings of freedom and equality in America that impinge on the larger history of the country.
We are recording this conversation in the spring of 2024 at a moment in which we are seeing a lot of protests on college campuses, including at the University of Minnesota, in support of Palestinians in the ongoing Israeli-Hamas war. I'm wondering, looking back on this long history of student organizing on college campuses, do you see parallels between the protests that we are seeing today and the student organizing of the 1960s?
Well, from my perspective as an historian, a multidisciplinary historian, I have to see that we are involved in a circuit, a repetition of lessons, both learned and failed over generations to resolve issues in the fabric and structure of our society and institutions that remain unresolved. Again, the year 1968, in which the Morrill Hall takeover is rooted, was a tumultuous year in this country on multiple fronts. And, the movements that roiled that era, whether we're talking about the anti-Vietnam War movement, whether we're talking about civil rights and Black power, whether we're talking about the feminist movements of other communities of color, all of these social movements have goals that remain not fully resolved as we look back from today. And the occupations now that students are taking on campuses across this country in the context of today's Israeli-Hamas war in Gaza clearly, have their antecedents in the Vietnam War protest of the earlier era.
Are there ways that you see the student protests and the administration responses today as different than the protests that we were seeing in the 1960s?
Institutional contexts have changed. The public funding for public land-grant universities like this has shrunk dramatically over the decades. And this university and universities like it are in much more treacherous positions than they were decades ago, which makes it more difficult for them in trying to navigate the terrain of student protests. We're also facing scenarios where the change in university administrations and their ability to deal with the social unrest as it works its way onto campuses is different. Back in the earlier years, university presidencies had more longevity. Many presidents stayed on 8, 10 years and more, which gave them a longer view of the up and downs of their presidencies and gave them perhaps a more composed vantage point from which to make tactical decisions about how to handle student protests. Today, the average tenure of a university president, the last statistics I saw, were 2 or 3 years,
Wow.
Which is not enough time for inexperienced university presidents to develop the chops to manage empathetically, strategically, the kind of student protests that they're facing here at the present. And the global circumstances have also changed. The years of the 70s and early 80s were also years on campuses of the South African apartheid disinvestment movement and the protests on the campus associated with that. Some of today's protests on campuses here over the Israeli-Hamas battle basically are harkened back to those disinvestment programs, but the circumstances have changed dramatically. So the past is not a clear model for the present, and developing historical consciousness about what patterns of the past are applicable to the present is a crucial part of what students have to learn and university administrations if they're going to be able to act effectively, justly in the here and now.
Professor John Wright, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
Playback is produced by me, Julie Censullo, with editorial support from Katie Thornton. Luke Heikela is our production manager. Lisa Blackstone is our archival producer, and Olivia Pelham is our production assistant. Eric Poggle recorded and mixed this episode. Daniel Bergen is our executive producer. Support for this podcast comes from the WEM Foundation Fund for History Production and Education. Playback is a production of Minnesota Experience Studios from Twin Cities PBS.